Thank you, Elena. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Hickman, the director of the Penn State All Sports Museum. Ken is a 1998 graduate of Penn State with degrees in history and political science. He also holds advanced degrees in history and library science from Drexel University and the University of Delaware. We're thrilled that he'll lead this morning's presentation, and we're looking forward to hearing him discuss the impact that Penn State student athletes had during World War I, when over 200 former lettermen entered the military. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Ken Hickman.
All right, thank you, Paul. Get settled here. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on what is probably one of the coldest mornings we've had so far this year. It's been so lovely all fall, and we come to a football weekend, and here we are in the teens. So as Paul mentioned, I'm here to talk about Penn State athletes during World War I. This presentation and the accompanying exhibit that is currently on display at the All Sports Museum is the result of about a year and a half's worth of original research conducted by myself and our intern, Nick Lebecki. That exhibit is currently on display and will be up through next April. And what we've found is just a wealth of absolutely fabulous stories, as well as I think have made a lot of great new friends in the descendants of some of our former service members. We have a number of them here with us today. But I think to get started, why don't we jump in the time machine? And we're going to go back to July 18th, 1918. It's about 4:30 in the morning. The fog is filtering, the sunlight is starting to filter through the morning fog, breaking up the mist in the forest d'Aretz. We're in the Enns-Marne part of France, to the east of Paris. And the landscape that is appearing before Second Lieutenant Levi Lamb is unlike any that he has seen during his time on the Western Front. Instead of the utter devastation, the elaborate trench networks that he had been used to, instead he was looking out from the forest at rolling fields of waist-high wheat glistening in the morning dew. It was a landscape that had been just more or less devoid of what he had seen elsewhere in France. His unit, the 9th Infantry's attack, was going to start soon, but in that moment, a quiet came down upon that forest, one that was described as so surreal that you could hear the birds in the trees. That stillness was a far cry from what had happened the day and night before. The 9th Infantry had expected to have a day of rest. Instead, they had been raced north as the Allies prepared to launch a counteroffensive against the Germans, an enemy that was becoming increasingly desperate to win the war before American manpower could decisively swing it against them. The last German offensive had just been stopped, and now it was time for the Allies to strike back. Only striking back was proving increasingly difficult to do. On the 17th, as they raced north, Lamb and his compatriots found themselves stuck in massive traffic jams behind the lines, enduring oppressive summer temperatures. That evening, a thunderstorm broke the heat, but turned all the roads into muddy quagmires. With sunset, a darkness of such intensity descended that men had to hold on to the belts of those in front of them to find their way. There was no hot food, and there certainly was no rest. Sometime after midnight, the 9th Infantry found themselves where they needed to be in position, but there was a shortage of machine guns, a shortage of grenades. Little reconnaissance had been conducted, but the attack orders had been given and results were expected. While the situation was far from ideal, Lamb and the rest of his platoon prepared for the assault. At 4:35 a.m., the Allied artillery opened fire. The shells crashed down, forming a wall for the 9th Infantry to advance behind, and it was time for them to go. So let's step away from Lieutenant Lamb for a moment, and we'll talk a little bit about how he ended up in France in the first place. He had graduated from Penn State in 1915, and he had left an institution that was in the midst of a great deal of growth. The previous decade, from 1905 to 1915, had seen enrollment more than triple, from 800 to over 2,500. We had seen a great deal of stability brought to campus with the appointment of President Edwin Sparks in 1908. He had helped put the college, and actually I want to emphasize that we're talking about the Pennsylvania State College today. We were not a university yet. Put the college back on a stable footing after the death of George Atherton in 1906 and the rather tumultuous two-year reign of James A. Beaver. And that would be the Beaver that the stadium is named after. In addition, that period also saw a tremendous amount of physical plant growth on campus. By 1918, there were more than 20 major buildings here at Penn State. This period also saw corresponding growth in intercollegiate athletics. By 1917, Penn State was fielding 9 varsity teams, and we were seeing tremendous success, just like now, in football and wrestling. Football had gone undefeated in 1911 and 1912. That 1912 team surrendered only 6 points all season, a record that still stands. So let's all think about, we think about the great defensive teams in the 1980s. Let's take a look at 1912. These are teams that were led by future Hall of Famers in Dex Very, Shorty Miller, Pete Moth, and backed by impressive lines featuring players such as James Bebout and Levi Lamb. Like today, wrestling in its earliest years was in the ascendancy. Between 1910 and 1917, wrestling posted a combined record of 34-3, largely powered by individuals such as Gilman Crockett, Thomas Jones, and again, Levi Lamb. Similarly, this is a period of success for baseball. We see Penn State producing a major leaguer in Big Ed Klepfer, a spitballer on the 1910 and 1911 teams. He was able to parlay his collegiate career into a contract with the New York Highlanders. We would know them today as the Yankees. Later moved to the Chicago White Sox in 1915, and will always be a bit of a historical footnote because later that season, he was one of 3 players the White Sox traded to Cleveland to obtain Shoeless Joe Jackson. When World War I broke out, he finished the season with the Cleveland Indians. It posted a 14-4 record that year, and ended up in France as a scout sniper with the 80th Division. And you can see up here he had a great quip about comparing German bullets to Walter Johnson fastballs. So what's going on in the world that these guys are living in? On April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I after more than 2 years of trying to maintain a very precarious neutrality. This is the nation's first major overseas conflict, and it saw a complete retooling and dedication of both the economy and higher education to help support the war effort. The war had begun on July 28, 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Yugoslav nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. And without going into the details, we can say that decades of imperial tensions, a failure of effective diplomacy, as well as a very elaborate system of alliances, led what should have been a minor war in the Balkans to turn into a general European war that more or less pitted the empires of Great Britain, France, Russia, and later Italy against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Fighting in Western Europe began in August 1914 and saw the Germans sweep through Belgium and into France. French and British forces were finally able to halt their advance in September 1914 at the First Battle of the Marne. And in the weeks that followed, both sides unsuccessfully tried to gain an advantage until the front had stabilized along an arc running from the English Channel to the Swiss frontier. To hold this line, both sides constructed elaborate networks of trenches, and over the next 2 years, both Germany and the Allies conducted a series of incredibly costly offensives in an attempt to break this front. And when I say incredibly costly, as one example, at the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army lost 19,000 killed. Not casualties, killed. That's on day one. In this time period, we see new technologies being developed to help break the front open, poison gas, military aircraft, the first tanks. Though public opinion in the United States when the war began was largely dedicated to maintaining neutrality, in early 1915, stories of German atrocities in Belgium began to swing public opinion, as did Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. This is essentially any merchant ship in the war zone is going to be sunk without warning. This policy in May 1915 led to the loss of the RMS Lusitania. This was a British passenger ship off the south coast of Ireland. And in that sinking, 1,198 folks were lost, including 128 Americans. International outrage, including that from President Woodrow Wilson, led to Germany abandoning unrestricted submarine warfare a short time later. Over the next 2 years, the uncertain neutrality continued until early 1917, when a series of events began to drive the United States towards war. Facing an increasingly desperate military situation, Germany opted to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, announcing it in January 1917. And later that winter, the American public was made aware of a German communication known as the Zimmermann telegram. This was essentially an enticement from Germany to the Mexican government, stating that if war with the United States were to occur, Germany would like to ally with Mexico with the promise that they would help Mexico regain lands lost during the Mexican-American War, namely Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. These incidents, plus the continued loss of American merchant shipping in March, led President Wilson to ask Congress for a declaration of war on April 2nd. Congress granted that on April 6th. So, for the folks here at Penn State, in 1916 and 1917, they're watching all these events unfold. There is an increasing sense that the United States is not ready for a major international war. And we see a number of former student athletes and students elect to join the National Guard at this point, which is growing. In early 1916, Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa raided across the southern border and attacked Columbus, New Mexico. This, plus the overseas situation, led Congress to pass the National Defense Act of 1916. This creates a number of programs we know today, most notably the concept of ROTC. Due to the crisis that was emerging on the southern border, many National Guard units were activated that summer. For Penn Staters, this meant being either pulled away from school or having to leave their careers. Two individuals here, Frederick Yeager, who had to leave Penn State. He was the star halfback on the football team. In 1915, was intending to be back here for the season in 1916, but instead was down in Texas on the border with the PA Guard. I should point out that head coach Dick Harlow at the time relentlessly pestered the U.S. Army about getting Fred Yeager let go, because damn it, he needed him here to play football. Someone else who was down on the border was a more recent alumni, James Dallas Red Bebout, graduated in 1914, had been a standout player on the 1911 and 1912 undefeated teams. As the crisis with Mexico had unfolded, he had joined the First District of Columbia Cavalry. He was working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture at the time. And he too ended up down on the Mexican border. For these folks, by and large, they came home in early 1917, but very few of them actually got arrested. Those who were deactivated were almost immediately recalled. Others came back north and were immediately sent to war mobilization camps. For those who were still students, who were here on campus, the shadow of war had grown increasingly long. As the events of the spring had unfolded, such as the Zimmerman telegram and loss of merchant shipping, the students and administration began to take at least symbolic action. And this included things such as in March 1917, the Board of Trustees offering all of the college's facilities to both the War Department and the Pennsylvania National Guard should war occur. With the declaration of war in April, a crisis occurred on campus. And that was largely that the overwhelming majority of the student body wanted to leave and go join the military or enter war work. For President Sparks and the administration, this obviously was a problem, to have the student body essentially walk away. The decision was made at that point that for those who wanted to leave to enter the military, you were free to do so. You would be given credit for the spring semester with the grades that you held on your last day of attending class. So if you have all A's and it's mid-April, good time to go. You need to pull those grades up a little bit, maybe stay a few more weeks. The other thing the administration did, and this was not just here but nationwide, working with the War Department, was to encourage those who were under draft age to stay in school. And I should point out that draft age at this point is 21. The argument being that the more education you receive, the more use you will be to the military once you finally join the service. For those who did stay through May, they were given a somewhat rare opportunity when Lieutenant Walter Whitehouse came to campus to recruit for the U.S. Army Ambulance Service. And that opportunity was the chance to serve in a unit with entirely people that they knew. And also, they were also offered the enticement that they would be among the first to ship out for Europe. On June 1st, 1917, 55 Penn Staters enlisted in the Army Ambulance Service. They were sent down to Camp Crane in Allentown, which was then the Allentown Fairgrounds. Arriving there, they were known as Penn State Unit Number 18, but very quickly thereafter were divided into two groups, Section 529 and 530. 529 was entirely comprised in its enlisted ranks of former Penn State students. 530 was a mixture of different schools. This was necessary because we are Penn State and we are motivated and enthusiastic, and we sent more men than they needed. Training through the fall at Camp Crane, we see former athletes such as Ben Cubbage, James O'Donnell, and Clarence Beck have the opportunity to continue playing football. They had played here, now they had an opportunity to play with the U.S. Army Ambulance Service football team. That team played a number of colleges and universities in the Northeast, including Penn State, and they must have been a fairly competitive team because we only beat them 10 to nothing. That November, as the ambulance men were sitting in Allentown, President Sparks needed assistance to help training the Corps cadets here on campus. And he approached the Army and asked if 529 could be sent back to campus for about 2 months to provide both an inspiration and an example for those students who were currently conducting military training. They come back to campus. The men in 529 loved it. They got to stay in the dorms. The food was much, much better than they were getting from the Army. It was nice to be home in a certain sense. And during this time, two of our former basketball players, Harry Jester and Herman Adams, both played for an ambulance service team that competed against our varsity team here at Penn State. And just like football, we won 40-26, though the Penn State Collegian, the newspaper of the time, did point out that Harry Jester's shooting was quite excellent. In May 1918, and this was a promise the Army did not come through on, the ambulance men sat in Allentown more or less as long as everybody else at other camps around the country. In May 1918, both sections shipped out on the liner in Giuseppe Verdi for Italy. So let's note that. They're going to Italy to fight with the Italians, not to France, to fight with the British, French, and Americans. Now, arriving in Genoa, Section 530, more or less stripped of its Penn Staters, was sent north to France, where 529 started moving towards the front. We have some great recollections of this movement, specifically describing driving through the Italian mountains at night without headlights, without guardrails on the roads, and more or less having to squint and just follow the bumper of the ambulance in front of you and hope that that guy knew where they were going. In August and September, 529 helped to clear advanced hospitals in northeastern Italy of wounded and other casualties in preparation for a major offensive. Now, on October 24th, the Italians launched what would be the final offensive on the Italian front, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. And throughout that campaign, Section 529 followed behind, shuttling wounded back from the front to mobile hospitals and back to base hospitals further in the rear. With the end of the war on that front on November 3rd, following the armistice with the Austrians, 529 continued to move patients as needed, but had the incredible opportunity for the next several months to more or less sightsee their way around Italy. There wasn't a lot for them to do, particularly after New Year's 1919, and we have great recollections from former members of visiting Pompeii and Naples and Capri, and they really had a wonderful opportunity to see Italy and experience Europe. In April 1919, that unit came home and was mustered out, having moved over 13,000 patients, a total of 46,600 miles during their service in Italy. I should point out that every member of Section 529 received the Italian War Cross from the Italian government. All told, here at Penn State, about 2,200 former students and alumni and faculty served in some capacity. Of those, about 210 were former student athletes, so about 10%. And what we found in our research is that they are an extremely representative group. The student athletes entered each branch of service at about the same rate as the rest of the student body. They suffered about the same rate of casualties. So it's been very instructive for us to be able to simply look at our little corner of the world in athletics and be able to see a bigger picture across campus. Of the 210 former athletes who did serve, about 50 saw combat in one form or another. And we'll kind of run through the different branches here. We had 18 former athletes who opted to go into the U.S. Navy. Should point out that one of the newest branches or specialties in the Navy at this point in time was naval aviation. And 8 of the 18, so not quite half, already had that little bit of Top Gun in them and elected for flight training. Those individuals, by and large, would have been sent to ground school and then to a naval air station to do their primary flight training. Others, such as Donald Mackenzie Brown, who had been a member of the track team here, took a more conventional route. He served in surface warfare, was the executive officer aboard submarine chaser number 1, and saw active duty in Queenstown, Ireland, and Plymouth, England, conducting anti-submarine patrols, as well as helping escort in inbound convoys from North America. Now, given that the role that submarines had played in pulling the country into the war, it seems it was only fitting that we had a number of former athletes who elected to go into the submarine service. One, Robert Edgerton, who had played football here, worked on submarines up in New London, Connecticut, still sort of home of the U.S. subforce. Excuse me. Harold Shore, who had played basketball, served aboard USS K3. oh, excuse me. Oh, and it operated along the East Coast with a base in Key West. Interestingly, Lieutenant Junior Grade William Bear came out of sub school, was a bit of a star, and was given command of his own submarine, the USS B-2, but in the Philippines. The majority of American submarines at this point in time were not necessarily seagoing oceanic vessels. He traveled out to the Philippines. We have some great stories from his family. His brother was working for a railroad in China. He stopped in China on his way to the Philippines to try to see his brother, but was prevented from doing so because local warlords had cut the railroad. But Bear arrives in the Philippines, takes command of his submarine, is somewhat alarmed to find out that, that it had been raised off the bottom of Manila Bay the previous year, having already sunk once due to mechanical problems. But one of the things we found particularly interesting with him is that in joining the military to go fight the Germans and the Austrians, he actually ended up farther away from the front in the military than he would have if he had stayed here in school. Circling back to kind of the Top Gun mentality. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, powered flight was less than 14 years old. And we're not 14 years off of the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. Military aviation was still a new specialty in every branch of the service, and in the Army, at this point, it was overseen by the Signal Corps. When the war began, the Signal Corps had less than 90 pilots and students in the pipeline, and there was immediately a recognized need to expand the training system quickly and comprehensively to provide the number of pilots, observers, and mechanics and other ground staff that were going to be needed to fight overseas. In terms of student athletes, we saw 19 former student athletes go into the Air Service. And for them, training typically consisted of going through about an 8-week ground school here in the United States. That was done at 8 different colleges and universities. If you were coming out of Penn State, you likely were either going up to Cornell or, dare I say, out to Columbus to Ohio State. Most went to Cornell. I think we're happy about that. Once you completed ground school, if you graduated, you passed all of your tests, you'd be sent on to primary flight training. This could happen either here in the United States, usually at an airfield out in Texas or elsewhere in the Great Plains. Obviously, wide open spaces, good place to learn how to fly. Or you would be sent overseas to do it, usually primary training at Tours in France, with advanced training at Issoudun, which is a little bit south of Tours. The 3rd Aviation Instruction Center at Issoudun became the largest American air base in France during the war and was one of the largest aviation facilities the U.S. military built until the years before World War II. One of the first former Nittany Lions to reach for the skies was Richard Stanley Davis. He had been a football player here, had helped manage the track team, had graduated in 1916, and in early 1917, eager to play a role even before the United States had entered the war, he told the State Department that he wanted a passport to go to Great Britain to work with the YMCA. Now, at this point in time, the YMCA was one of the leading service and aid organizations in the world. They were operating canteens and other such facilities. Many of the roles would be fulfilled by the USO today. But he was going to go to Britain and work with the YMCA. As soon as he gets to Britain, either as a last-minute decision or his intent all along, he is on a steamer across the channel to volunteer with the American Volunteer Motor Ambulance Corps. Again, this is a volunteer unit of Americans driving ambulances on the Western Front. He does this through the summer of 1917, and decides that this is just not exciting enough. In August 1917, he, I think having seen the French Air Force and the RAF, decides, I really want to learn how to fly. Enlists in the very fledgling U.S. Army Air Service, there in France, but there's no infrastructure in place for him to do his training. We're about 4 months after the declaration of war. So instead, Davis is turned over to the French. He goes and conducts his basic flight training at Tours. The French had already started building a facility at Issoudun. He moves on to Issoudun for his advanced training and continues to do so through the spring of 1918 before being assigned in that summer to the French 77th Escadrille, which is a French term for squadron. That summer, flying over Montdidier, Château-Thierry, and Soissons, he tangled with German aircraft, scored 2 confirmed kills, as well as won the French Croix de Guerre with Palm. As one of the few American pilots who had extensive combat experience, in September, he was recalled to the American service and made an instructor at Issoudun. He commanded Field Number 7. He was the one who was going to teach you how to fly formation. The training process there was you'd move through a series of fields from learning how to taxi on the ground up through observation or aerial combat. But Stanley Davis was going to teach you how to fly with the guy next to you without crashing into him. It's very interesting to look at correspondence from other Penn State pilots writing back to the, to the student newspaper, because so many of them mention that they ran into Stanley Davis at Issoudun and he helped teach them this or that. Davis proved such a skilled instructor that after the war he was personally commended by American Commander John J. Pershing for his efforts in instructing American pilots. One of the fellows who passed through Issoudun, little before Stanley Davis was there, was William C. Whitey Thomas. Thomas was known for his exceptionally bright blonde hair. He was a fixture on the Atlantic City Beach Patrol in the summer. I believe he was second generation, and there has been a Thomas on the Atlantic City Beach Patrol to this day. It's just something every generation in that family does. He had elected to come here to Penn State. It was rare because he was an out-of-state student, which at that point in time was rather unusual. On the football team, he had established himself in 1914 and 15 as an outstanding end. He had a specialty for intercepting passes. But in the spring of 1918, he found himself overseas at Tours learning how to fly. And we're extremely fortunate in his case that many of his personal papers are now with the Air Force Museum out in Dayton and are available for research and for folks to go take a look at. Graduating from Tours, he completed the course at Issoudun as an observation and reconnaissance pilot. On September 1st, he was assigned to the 12th Aero Squadron and moved to the front. Flying Salmson 2A2s, the 12th Air Squadron provided both reconnaissance for the American divisions below, as well as help spot for the artillery. He fulfilled these duties during both the San Miguel offensives and during the Meuse-Argonne offensives, and was twice recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. In neither time was it awarded. His observer received a DSC for one of those flights, so I'm curious to know who Whitey ticked off that his was not approved. Instead, he received what was then known as 2 citation stars. Citation stars are the forerunner of the current Silver Star Medal. When the Silver Star was instituted in 1932, both of Thomas's citation stars were upgraded, and he was issued a Silver Star with an oak leaf cluster. For Thomas's family and a number of our Flying Lions families, their service in France inspired family traditions. In Thomas's case, his son, William Carl Thomas, flew as a fighter pilot with the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, transferred when the service became the U.S. Air Force, and served as a fighter pilot in both Korea and Vietnam, commanding a tactical fighter wing in Southeast Asia. Whitey's grandson, Scott Shields, flew F-4s for the Navy in Vietnam. And we have a great story, and this is some of the things that we've come across, that some of the later family stories are as interesting as our World War I stories. But Scott Shields came back from one of his first missions in Vietnam, lands on the USS Kitty Hawk, and finds his uncle, who at this point is a lieutenant colonel, standing on the flight deck waiting for him. And for the next 3 days, his uncle pestered the air group commander on the Kitty Hawk to let him fly as his nephew's backseater. And I can only imagine the headaches that the CAG on the Kitty Hawk had, having to deal with this obnoxious Air Force guy who wants to fly with his rookie nephew, and just imagining what would happen if the two of them got shot down. Suffice it to say, Wild Bill, as he was known, was packed on a plane back to the mainland pretty quickly. For the majority of Penn Staters who served, they served in the U.S. Army. I don't think we're terribly surprised by that. With the American entry into the war, Nittany Lion lettermen quickly joined the fight. Some were established professionals in their fields, some were still students. But as those who sought to serve left school, the majority of them applied to officers' training camps that had been established around the country. There were 16 total. At these camps, they would have been taught in a 3-month training program, the basics of leadership and tactics, and would have adjusted to the rigors of military life. This was an exhausting program that typically began around 5 o'clock in the morning, ended about 10 o'clock at night. And at the end of their 90 days, they would be commissioned as second lieutenants. And I think a lot of folks know the term 90-day wonder and associate that with World War II, but like so many World War II things, the origins were actually earlier in World War I. For those who opted to simply enlist, their training regimen was somewhat similar. They would have been taught basic military skills, marksmanship, close order drill. While the majority of former athletes served in the classic branches of infantry, artillery, or in the engineers, we have a number who helped pioneer new fields. One, former wrestler Thomas Jones, went into the 301st Tank Battalion, actually served with the British in France, and helped lay the foundation for the future of armored warfare. Edgar Wilcox served as a captain with the Chemical Warfare Service. This was the service that oversaw things such as poison gas. I had an interesting conversation with the Chemical Warfare Service Museum in that we learned that the Chemical Warfare Service, because they were a new branch, actively recruited athletes from colleges and from the professional ranks with the mentality of, one, they were high profile and could help advance the image of the service, and the other being that if you could throw a baseball really far, or you could throw a football really far, I bet you can throw a gas grenade really far. In each case, regardless of what the specialty might be, most of the late 1917 and early 1918 was spent training here stateside. This would be, for the infantry folks, this would be learning specialized topics like field fortifications, trench warfare, bayonet combat. It wasn't until the late spring, May, June, that the majority of former Nittany Lions actually embarked for France. Arriving in ports such as Brest and Saint-Nazaire, they would have come off their transport and joined the American Expeditionary Forces under the command of Pershing. So let's take a step back and revisit James Bebout, who we met down in Mexico. He had found very early on that letters from home brought the same joy and comfort that they had for generations of soldiers before. Writing home in July 1918, he commented that the letters I got from home are without a doubt the greatest and most appreciated inspiration I have, and I sit down and read every word of them and enjoy it all. He also commented a bit about what he thought this experience was going to mean for him, and stated that the French that lots of interesting things have happened. The French people and their country is quite different from anything I could have imagined. It's a great education, too. I'll be worth twice as much to myself after this war as I was before. It has all been a wonderful adventure. And he also had a comment about how he thought the war might play out, and stated that I know now that the Americans are going to be the deciding factor. We are better men than the Germans, and the very virtue which is found in nearly every American of quick action at all cost is the thing that the Germans fear most and the thing that is going to lick them. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Not used to having one of these that works. Okay. As American troops arrived in France, General Pershing insisted on an extremely rigorous training program. This typically called for additional training behind the lines, as well as spending time on quiet parts of the front, learning from British and French units. While this occurred for a number of American divisions, German actions in May, June, and July forced many American troops into action earlier than originally anticipated. To help halt the final German offensives, American divisions were moved forward to plug holes in the Allied lines. We see the first former lettermen, such as wrestler Gilman Crockett, entered the fray at places like Chateau Thierry with the 3rd Division. And with the final German push stopped in mid-July along the Marne, we see the first of several Allied counteroffensives that will ultimately lead to the end of the war. The first predominantly American offensive takes place on September 12th at Saint-Mihiel. The major American push in the Meuse-Argonne sector launches on September 26th. Now, it's still the deadliest battle in American history. The fighting in the Meuse-Argonne would last until the end of the war, 47 days later, on November 11th. So, let's go back to Levi Lamb. Now, Levi Lamb was a key figure for Penn State involved in the fighting on July 18th. He had been a three-sport star here at Penn State in football, wrestling, and track. He had grown up down in California, Pennsylvania, had attended Southwestern Normal School, which today is California University of Pennsylvania. Later attended Grove City College. And yes, he had 3 years of athletics at Grove City, and in this time period, that was okay. Levi Lamb arrived on campus at age 22, was a highly sought-after veteran athlete. Again, eligibility rules were very, very different, largely in that they did not exist. Going out on the football team in early 1911, Coach Bill Hollenbach had originally anticipated Lamb would make a great halfback. This fellow was upwards of 6'4", 200 pounds. Well, he also had a little knack for showboating. And at the first contact practice of 1911, Lamb goes out, is showing off, and a couple of the upperclassmen took issue with that and made it their mission to correct that attitude. And they did so by literally knocking him cold with one hit. Moved to tackle for future seasons, he played in 1911 and was a member of the undefeated 1912 team. But where he really made his name here at Penn State was as a wrestler. In his time here, he lost 2 wrestling matches in 4 years. The very first match he had his freshman year, and he was later beaten by Mike DeRizes from the University of Pennsylvania, a former Olympian who he was never defeated in his college career. An extremely popular individual on campus, Lamb graduated in 1915, went up to teach in Boston, also coached wrestling at MIT, but very quickly was offered a more lucrative teaching job out in North Dakota. He went out to Jamestown, North Dakota, taught, and was the athletic director at the high school there for a year until the war is declared in April 1917. Not hesitating, he immediately applied for one of the officers' training camps, was accepted to one at Fort Snelling, Minnesota, completed his 90-day course, and I'm sure he thought it fortunate at the time, was one of a select few who was chosen to immediately depart overseas for advanced training. Arriving in France that fall, he's assigned to the 9th Infantry, which in turn is attached to the 2nd Division. He sees training south of Verdun, takes part in some of the fighting around Chateau Thierry in June, but in July, we end up in the Forest de Retz. As the shelling started and the 1st Battalion of the 9th Infantry advanced out of the woods into the wheat, Lamb and 3rd Battalion followed about 300 meters behind, advancing in columns. Very soon after, German fire came from Levert Fuel Farm. To the left, the 1st Battalion peeled off to capture that farm, and Lamb and 3rd Battalion took the lead driving east. The morning saw heavy fighting around La Maison Neuve Farm and Beau Repair Farm. And by late afternoon, the 9th Infantry had passed the village of Vierzy and completely exhausted, stopped for the evening. When they counted the men in the ranks at the end of that advance, they found that casualties among the officers had been particularly high, and they included Levi Lamb. Lamb was the first former athlete to die in France in combat. He was the first of 8 former athletes to die during the war. And he had made such a profound impact as a student athlete here that his name lives on because in late 1953, the decision was made to rename Penn State's athletic annual fund in his honor. So anyone here who has season football tickets at some point has given to the Levi Lamb Fund. For many former Nittany Lions, their first experience of combat took place in the Meuse-Argonne, starting on September 26. The point of that offensive was to break through the German Hindenburg Line and ultimately reach the city of Sedan. The early days and weeks of the offensive saw American forces take heavy casualties as they struggled over incredibly difficult terrain and faced fierce German resistance. So given that this is a football weekend, let's focus on 2 former football players who fought in the Meuse-Argonne. The first, and one of the oldest lettermen to serve in France during World War I, was Dr. James McKibben. He had played football here, was a member of the 1894 football team that had gone undefeated. He graduated from Penn State, attended medical school at the University of Pennsylvania, and had established a practice down in Buck Valley, Pennsylvania, south central PA. Despite being married with 2 daughters, McKibben elected to leave his practice and entered a medical officer's training camp in 1917. He was promoted to captain that fall and ultimately attached to oversee a medical detachment with the 308th Infantry in the 77th Division. And looking at their insignia, 3 guesses what state the 77th Division was from. On October 14th, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, McKibben saw a sergeant get wounded in front of their trenches. Without hesitating, he leapt out of the trenches to retrieve that soldier and give aid, and in the process was severely wounded in the abdomen. Taken to Mobile Hospital No. 4, he died several days later and posthumously received the Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism. So, again, 77th Division, clearly from New York. Divisions composed of draftees during World War I were largely geographically based. So if you were from eastern Pennsylvania, you likely were assigned to the 79th Division. If you were from western Pennsylvania, you were likely assigned to the 80th Division. And it's part of this process that former football players, Bob Higgins and James Bebo, both end up in the 318th Infantry in the 80th Division. Younger than Bebo, Bob Higgins had played football here. He left after his junior year to enter the Army. Bebo, who we have met previously, had been in Mexico. He had attended an officer's training camp, was now a commissioned first lieutenant. And arriving in Europe, the regiment attempted to make Bebo the transportation officer for his battalion. Would have provided some degree of safety. He kicked and fought his way back to his line company rather than leave his men. After a period of training with the British, the 80th Division took its place in line for the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and though initially held in reserve, Bebo's company entered the fray late on September 29th. He was slightly wounded in the mouth earlier in the day, but that evening he volunteered to lead a platoon to reestablish contact with a unit on the 318th left. Moving out, he was killed a short time later by German machine gun fire near the Bois de Bruel. Due to a variety of factors, including difficulty in getting reports back from the front, challenges in finding remains, and simply the volume of casualties. Over 26,000 Americans died during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was often a situation where families did not hear of a loved one's fate for an extended period. As a result, it was fairly common that if you had friends or family serving overseas, that you may hear of somebody's fate from them before you actually receive the official telegram from the War Department. Learning of Bebo's death, Bob Higgins wrote a letter home to a mutual friend, Charlie Heppenstall, who had played football here, informing him of their comrade's fate. As censorship regulations prevented Higgins from explicitly stating that James Bebo had been killed, Higgins instead wrote that, "I lost a very dear friend killed. He played left guard on the state team and graduated in 1914 and had red hair." Penn State has always been a tight-knit community, but it was even tighter-knit back then, especially among athletes. Anybody who had played football here in the teens would have known exactly who Bob Higgins was referring to. Bebo's brother-in-law received this letter from Higgins, he took it to his father-in-law, Bebo's father. They both believed the information contained to be correct, and James Bebo, the father, began informing the rest of the family, though he consistently struggled with how to approach his wife and to break the news that their son had been killed. What we have here is a telegram that he sent to his daughter, Helen Corbett, who lived in San Francisco, relating the story that I've just told you. In terms of Bob Higgins, he remained at the front for the rest of the war, came home afterwards. I think to wrap up here, I'd just like to acknowledge the 5 other former student athletes who died during the war. The first, Sergeant Milton Bishop, was killed when his regiment, the 110th Infantry's headquarters, was hit by a German shell. Captain Kirby Sleppy, who was killed by a German shell while trying to get his men to cover. First Lieutenant Thomas Krebel was killed by a German sniper on the second day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Second Lieutenant Eddie Moore died during the early days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and the records are not clear as to what exactly did happen to him. And lastly, Ensign David Blair Mingle, a naval aviator, who died after the war had ended in February 1919. He was a trained pilot and was working as an instructor at Pensacola when the engine on his aircraft cut out at 500 feet and they plunged to the bay below. So given that today is Veterans Day, which is a World War I holiday, I'd certainly like to acknowledge these 5 men as well as Levi Lamb, James Bebout, and Dr. James McKibben, and thank them for their contributions both to Penn State and to our country as a whole. All right, thank you.
Let's have another round of applause for Ken Hickman and join me in thanking him.